It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. October 12, 2024. Greensboro, North Carolina. Tyrek Burton, a 37-year-old father, stood at the altar, surrounded by family and friends, looking into the eyes of the woman he had loved for years. Kiara Holloway, now his wife, had just vowed to spend forever with him. Their wedding was filled with laughter, the embrace of loved ones, and the promise of a future they had both dreamed of. Their young daughter, too young to understand the meaning of the day, beamed with joy as she watched her parents celebrate a love she had always known. But forever would only last 7 hours. By the time the music faded and the last of their guests trickled out of Barber Park Event Center, the night had taken a different turn. It wasn't the exhaustion of a long wedding day that weighed on them. It was something else. Something they didn't see coming. A confrontation in the parking lot. Raised voices. A man they had never met before. And then, gunfire. Tyrek Burton, the groom who had pledged his life to the woman he adored, lay bleeding on the asphalt. The same hands that had held Kiara just hours before were now slipping from hers. Their daughter, still in her dress from the ceremony, stood just feet away as the world around her collapsed. The man responsible vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but shattered lives and unanswered questions. Who was he? Why did a wedding celebration end with a murder? And how does a man walk away from such an act without a trace? Tonight, we tell the story of a love that should have lasted a lifetime. A wedding night turned into a crime scene. And a killer still at large. This is the murder of Tyrek Burton. Tyrek Burton was never the kind of man who sought the spotlight. He didn't crave attention, nor did he demand recognition. He lived for the people he loved, and in their eyes, that was enough. Born and raised in Greensboro, North Carolina, Tyrek grew up in a city known for its deep history, its bustling streets, and the kind of southern charm that made strangers feel like neighbors. It was a place where community meant something. A place where life could be simple, steady, until it wasn't. Tyrek was a man of quiet strength, known for his dedication to his family and the unwavering kindness he extended to those around him. He worked hard, not just for himself, but for the people who depended on him. Friends described him as reliable, loyal, the kind of person who would show up when it mattered, no questions asked. He had met Kiara Holloway years earlier, in a moment neither of them could have predicted would change their lives forever. Their love wasn't the kind that burned fast and faded quickly. It was slow, steady, built on years of trust, patience, and understanding. Kiara had seen the best of him, and she had seen him through the hardest times. Together, they built a life, one that was filled with challenges, like any other, but one that was always rooted in love. They raised a daughter, a little girl who was the very center of their world. For Tyrek, nothing mattered more than ensuring she grew up knowing she was safe, loved, and protected. On the morning of October 12, 2024, Tyrek and Kiara stood together, hands clasped, hearts full, as they made their vows. The moment was everything they had imagined. The culmination of years of love, struggle, and dreams finally realized. Family and friends gathered to celebrate them, toasting to a future they believed was just beginning. Photos from that night show a couple bathed in joy, smiling, laughing, holding each other as if time had stopped. If only it had. Because what those images don't show is what came after. What they don't capture is the terror, the blood, the way Kiara's world collapsed in a single instant. That night, in the parking lot of the Barber Park Event Center, her husband, the man who had just promised her a lifetime, was ripped away from her forever. Kiara Holloway and family. Kiara Holloway never imagined her wedding dress would become a symbol of grief. She had spent months planning that day, ensuring every detail was perfect. The flowers, the music, the venue. Everything had to be just right, because this was more than a wedding. It was the beginning of the rest of their lives. She remembers the way Tyrek held her as they danced. The way he whispered something only she could hear, making her laugh. The way their daughter clung to his leg, refusing to let go. And then, just hours later, she remembers the way his body collapsed to the ground, the way his blood pooled beneath him, the way their daughter's cries filled the night air, cutting through the silence like a blade. It happened too fast. A confrontation over a moment on the road. A stranger, angry, shouting. Then a gun. Kiara screamed for help, her hands pressed against his chest, desperate to stop the bleeding. But there was nothing she could do. Nothing anyone could do. The shooter was gone. And Tyrek, her husband, the father of her child, was never coming back. In the days that followed, grief consumed everything. Social media became flooded with posts from those who knew him, those who loved him. Messages of shock, sorrow, and confusion. How does something like this happen? Who does this? Why isn't he here? Kiara, now a widow, was left with nothing but memories. And a daughter who would grow up without her father. Greensboro, North Carolina, is not a city known for its violence. It is a city with a rich past, a place where history lingers in the streets, where families build their futures. But beneath the surface, like any city, there are fractures. And on October 12, 2024, one of those fractures became a chasm. The Barber Park Event Center sits nestled in the heart of the city, a place designed for joy, for celebration. Weddings, birthdays, family reunions. A space meant for memories, not for crime scenes. That night, as the last of the guests departed, the parking lot was quiet. The laughter had faded, the music had stopped. Only the hum of distant traffic remained. And then, gunshots. What should have been just another night in Greensboro became something else entirely. A family was shattered. A community was left searching for answers. And a killer walked away, disappearing into the darkness. This is where the investigation begins. The night should have ended with nothing more than exhaustion from hours of celebration. The last guests had begun to trickle out of the Barber Park Event Center. The music had faded, and the glow of wedding lights reflected against the pavement as Tyrek Burton and Kiara Holloway made their way to their car. Their daughter, still in her dress from the ceremony, clung to her mother's hand, too tired to keep up with the excitement. What should have been the quiet end to a perfect evening was anything but. Because in the darkness of that parking lot, someone else was waiting. Reconstructing the fatal night. It started with something so small. Something that should have been forgettable. A car. A moment of frustration. A decision that, under any other circumstances, would have meant nothing at all. Somewhere on the road that night, before they ever arrived at the venue, Tyrek Burton had unknowingly crossed paths with the man who would take his life. According to police reports, an unidentified driver accused Tyrek of cutting him off in traffic. No one knows exactly what happened in those brief seconds, a miscalculation, an impatient lane change, or maybe nothing at all. But for the man in that other car, it was enough. Enough to follow Tyrek. Enough to wait. Enough to kill. As Tyrek and Kiara walked to their car, voices cut through the silence. The man had found him. The confrontation began with words. Angry. Accusatory. The kind of words meant to provoke, to escalate. Witnesses recall the man's voice rising, accusing Tyrek of reckless driving, of disrespect. Insisting that Tyrek had disrespected him on the road. Tyrek, just hours into his marriage, was not looking for a fight. He had his wife by his side. His daughter's small hand in Kiara's grasp. He had no reason to argue, no reason to engage in whatever this was. But the man in front of him did. No one knows exactly what was said in those final moments. Maybe Tyrek tried to de-escalate, to explain, to end it before it went too far. Maybe he realized too late that there was no reasoning with the man standing before him. Then the gun came out. Shots rang out. The sound shattered the stillness of the night, a sharp crack ripping through the air. One shot. Then another. Tyrek's body jerked, stumbling backward. Blood seeped into his crisp wedding suit, the same suit he had worn just hours earlier as he danced with his wife. A final shot. Then, silence. The man who had confronted him, who had executed him, turned and walked away. No hurry. No panic. He left as if nothing had happened. As if a life had not just been stolen. Tyrek lay on the ground. His wife, screaming. Their daughter, standing frozen, watching the world she knew fall apart. We were still outside, saying goodbye to people when we heard the yelling. It happened so fast. 1 minute, everything was fine. The next, the shots. I ran, but when I turned back, he was just on the ground. Kiara was screaming, trying to hold him, but, witness voice breaks, unable to finish. He kept saying he was sorry. He was looking at me, and he just kept saying he was sorry. I was holding him, and he wouldn't stop bleeding. I kept telling him he was going to be okay. But he wasn't. We arrived on the scene at approximately 11:34 p.m. to find a male victim suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but the victim was pronounced deceased at the scene. The suspect had fled before officers arrived. And the most haunting witness of all. A child. A little girl who had spent the entire day watching her parents celebrate their love. A little girl who, in an instant, became a witness to murder. She was too young to understand the finality of death. Too young to know that her father wasn't getting back up. All she knew was that one moment, he was there. And the next, he wasn't. How the shooter fled the scene. No screeching tires. No getaway car racing down the road. By the time police arrived, the parking lot was empty. The man who had just taken Tyrek's life had vanished into the night. No one knew his name. No one knew his face. All they had were the echoes of gunfire and the image of a bride kneeling beside her husband's body. A wedding night turned crime scene. And a killer who, as of this moment, is still out there. This is where the search for justice begins. The sirens cut through the night, their wailing growing louder as they closed in on the scene. It had taken mere seconds for Tyrek Burton's life to be taken. But for law enforcement, for Kiara, for the family left behind, the search for answers would stretch into something much longer. No one knows exactly what was said in those final moments. Maybe Tyrek tried to de-escalate, to explain, to end it before it went too far. Maybe he realized too late that there was no reasoning with the man standing before him. Then, the gun came out. Shots rang out. The sound shattered the stillness of the night, a sharp crack ripping through the air. One shot. Then another. Tyrek's body jerked, stumbling backward. Blood seeped into his crisp wedding suit, the same suit he had worn just hours earlier as he danced with his wife. A final shot. Then, silence. The man who had confronted him, who had executed him, turned and walked away. No hurry. No panic. He left as if nothing had happened. As if a life had not just been stolen. Tyrek lay on the ground. His wife, screaming. Their daughter, standing frozen, watching the world she knew fall apart. We were still outside, saying goodbye to people when we heard the yelling. It happened so fast. 1 minute, everything was fine. The next, the shots. I ran, but when I turned back, he was just on the ground. Kiara was screaming, trying to hold him, but, witness voice breaks, unable to finish. He kept saying he was sorry. He was looking at me, and he just kept saying he was sorry. I was holding him, and he wouldn't stop bleeding. I kept telling him he was going to be okay. But he wasn't. We arrived on the scene at approximately 11:34 p.m. to find a male victim suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures, but the victim was pronounced deceased at the scene. The suspect had fled before officers arrived. And the most haunting witness of all. A child. A little girl who had spent the entire day watching her parents celebrate their love. A little girl who, in an instant, became a witness to murder. She was too young to understand the finality of death. Too young to know that her father wasn't getting back up. All she knew was that one moment, he was there. And the next, he wasn't. How the shooter fled the scene. No screeching tires. No getaway car racing down the road. By the time police arrived, the parking lot was empty. The man who had just taken Tyrek's life had vanished into the night. No one knew his name. No one knew his face. All they had were the echoes of gunfire and the image of a bride kneeling beside her husband's body. A wedding night turned crime scene. And a killer who, as of this moment, is still out there. This is where the search for justice begins. The sirens cut through the night, their wailing growing louder as they closed in on the scene. It had taken mere seconds for Tyrek Burton's life to be taken. But for law enforcement, for Kiara, for the family left behind, the search for answers would stretch into something much longer. By the time the first squad car pulled into the parking lot, the damage had already been done. Tyrek lay motionless on the pavement, his blood pooling beneath him. Kiara was still by his side, her wedding dress now stained a deep crimson. Wedding guests stood in small clusters, some crying, some frozen in shock. Others, still struggling to process what had just unfolded before their eyes. And the man responsible? Gone. He had vanished into the night. Now, it was up to the police to piece together the puzzle. Immediate police response. At 11:34 p.m., Greensboro police officers arrived at the Barber Park Event Center parking lot after multiple 911 calls reported gunfire. The first priority was securing the scene. Officers immediately blocked off the area, pushing back distraught wedding guests as crime scene tape was stretched across the lot. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Tyrek Burton was pronounced dead at the scene. Despite the chaos, police needed statements. Witnesses were questioned one by one. Those who had seen the argument unfold, those who had heard the gunshots, those who had caught only a glimpse of the shooter before he disappeared. A few key details emerged. The suspect was a man. He had been arguing with Tyrek about a traffic incident earlier that night. He had pulled a gun. He had fired multiple times. And then he had walked away. But that was all they had. No license plate. No clear description. No security camera that captured his face. And as the hours stretched into morning, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This was not going to be an easy case to solve. Physical and forensic evidence. In any homicide investigation, physical evidence is key. And while the parking lot wasn't an ideal crime scene, open, public, vulnerable to contamination, detectives knew that even the smallest detail could break the case open. Surveillance footage. The first step was to examine security cameras. The Barber Park Event Center had cameras mounted on its exterior, covering parts of the parking lot, but they were old, grainy, and positioned too far to capture a clear image of the suspect. The footage confirmed what witnesses had already described. A man confronting Tyrek. A struggle, though brief. A gun being drawn. Tyrek collapsing as the shooter walked away. The problem? The suspect's face was never clearly captured. The camera's poor resolution and the angle of the footage meant that his defining features were obscured by shadows. There were no street cameras in the immediate vicinity that could have captured where he went next. For now, the footage was a lead, but not enough to identify the killer. At the scene, several shell casings were recovered. Ballistics testing later confirmed that the bullets came from a .40 caliber handgun, one of the most common firearm types in the United States. A gun of that caliber wouldn't necessarily narrow down the suspect list. But if police could find a weapon that matched, it could be the key piece of evidence they needed to link someone to the crime. The problem? They had no suspect to match it to. Eyewitness accounts can be unreliable. Memory distorts under stress. Details blur. But sometimes, a single statement can change everything. Detectives pushed for more. One witness described the suspect's voice as deep, possibly southern accented. Another thought they saw him get into a vehicle, but couldn't be sure. One guest swore they recognized the man from somewhere before, but couldn't place it. Every piece of information helped, but none of it was enough. The biggest question still remained. Was this really just a random act of road rage? Or was there something more? Public and media reaction. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By the next morning, local headlines were already circulating. Groom fatally shot hours after wedding in Greensboro. Gunman still at large after parking lot murder. The story caught fire online. Social media was flooded with posts from friends, family, and concerned citizens. Kiara Holloway's first public statement, Instagram, 24 hours later. I don't know how to say this. I don't know how to even breathe right now. Tyrek was my heart, my soul, my husband, my best friend. He didn't deserve this. If you know anything, please come forward. Please help me find who did this. The post was shared thousands of times. A GoFundMe page was launched to help Kiara and her daughter, raising thousands within days. But the most important thing was getting answers. Detectives urged the public to come forward with any leads. Anonymous tip lines were set up. Local news stations ran segments asking for information. And yet, days passed, then weeks, and no suspect was identified. Challenges in the case. Homicide detectives knew one thing for certain: time was working against them. The longer a case remains unsolved, the harder it becomes to close. With each passing day, memories faded. Potential witnesses moved on. Evidence became more difficult to track. The biggest issue? They had no name. The shooter was a ghost, a man whose anger had flared in a moment and disappeared just as quickly. Could this become a cold case? It happens more often than people think. According to FBI data, about 40% of homicides in the U.S. go unsolved. Some remain open for years. Some never get solved at all. Detectives weren't giving up. But with no clear suspect, no obvious motive beyond a fleeting moment of rage, the investigation had hit a dead end. Where does the case stand now? A husband was dead. A wife was left grieving. A daughter would grow up without a father. And somewhere, a killer was still free. Was this a planned attack or a chance encounter that ended in violence? Was this truly about road rage, or was there a deeper connection between Tyrek and his killer? One thing was certain. Until police had answers, justice remained out of reach. But the search wasn't over yet. Because as the investigation continued, new questions would arise. And one of them might hold the key to finding out the truth. This is where the legal battle begins. A man was dead. A wife was grieving. A family was shattered. And the person responsible had walked away, disappearing into the night as if he had never been there at all. For detectives in Greensboro, this was not just another case. This was a murder committed in front of dozens of witnesses. A murder that happened just hours after a wedding. A crime that should have been solvable. And yet, days passed. Then weeks. Then months. And still, the shooter's name remained unknown. No arrest. No justice. No answers. Just an open case file, a grieving widow, and a killer still walking free. In the wake of Tyrek Burton's murder, Greensboro police were under immense pressure to find the person responsible. From the very beginning, they knew that time was not on their side. Homicide investigations often work in a race against the clock. The first 48 hours are critical, the time when witnesses' memories are freshest, when the killer is most likely to make a mistake, and when public attention is at its peak. But now, that window was closing. With no clear suspect, no known name, and only blurry surveillance footage, investigators had to broaden their approach. Community outreach and Crime Stoppers appeals. The Greensboro Police Department turned to the public for help. They issued a press release urging anyone who had been at the wedding, or who may have seen the suspect, to come forward. Local news stations aired Crime Stoppers appeals, offering a cash reward for information leading to an arrest. Billboards went up across the city. Flyers with Tyrek Burton's photo were posted in grocery stores, gas stations, and street corners with one desperate plea: "Do you know who killed this man?" But despite their best efforts, the response was frustratingly slow. Some tips trickled in, but none led to a solid suspect. Police followed up on every lead, every supposed sighting, every vague description, every possible connection. Nothing. As the weeks stretched into months, detectives faced a chilling reality. This case might not be solved quickly. And if they weren't careful, it might not be solved at all. Theories on the shooter's identity. With no suspect in custody, speculation began to take hold. The public, the media, even law enforcement, everyone had their own theories. Because one question haunted this case from the very beginning. Was this really just an impulsive act of road rage? Or was there something deeper at play? The simplest theory was also the one that law enforcement initially leaned toward. That the shooter was a stranger. A man who felt slighted in traffic. A man who let his temper get the best of him. A man who followed Tyrek to the event center, waited for the right moment, and then acted on impulse. The problem? This wasn't typical road rage behavior. Most road rage incidents involve shouting, honking, aggressive driving. At worst, physical altercations or weapons flashed in the heat of the moment. But stalking someone to their destination? Waiting, then executing them in cold blood before calmly walking away? That was different. That suggested intent. And that meant the shooter's actions might not have been random at all. Another possibility? Tyrek wasn't even the intended target. What if the shooter had been looking for someone else? What if he had followed the wrong car? Or confused Tyrek with someone he had a past conflict with? Mistaken identity has led to countless homicides, killings based on a simple, fatal misunderstanding. But there was one major flaw with this theory. If the shooter had truly realized he had killed the wrong person, wouldn't he have panicked? Wouldn't he have shown some sign of hesitation? Instead, he had been calm, deliberate. He hadn't run. He had walked away. And that suggested something more personal. Then there was the most disturbing theory of all. That this was never about road rage. That this was never random. That the man who pulled the trigger had done so because he wanted Tyrek Burton dead. If this was true, the real question was, why? Was it personal? Had Tyrek crossed paths with someone in the past? Someone who had been waiting for the right moment? Could there have been a deeper motive that hadn't yet surfaced? Police explored every possibility. They dug into Tyrek's past, his relationships, any conflicts he may have had. But by all accounts, Tyrek had no enemies. He wasn't involved in any criminal activity. He had just married the woman he loved. He had a daughter who adored him. To everyone who knew him, he was a good man. And that made his death all the more senseless. Potential breakthroughs. Any new updates? Months had passed. The case was growing colder. But Greensboro detectives refused to give up. In January 2025, 3 months after the murder, police revealed they had a new lead. They had identified a person of interest. No name was released. No arrests were made. But sources indicated that investigators had obtained new evidence. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? Or would it be just another dead end? For Kiara Holloway, for her daughter, for Tyrek's grieving family, the wait for justice continued. And somewhere, The man who had pulled the trigger was still out there. Still free. Still unknown. But the truth has a way of coming out. Sometimes, it just takes longer than anyone expects. This isn't over. Because even in the darkest cases, justice can still find its way through. And in the next chapter, we explore what happens when a case goes unsolved for too long. What happens when the legal system fails to deliver justice? And how sometimes, the most unexpected clue can change everything. A wedding dress hung untouched in a closet. Photos from a day filled with laughter, love, and promises remained frozen in time. A little girl, too young to understand the weight of her loss, continued asking a question no one could answer. Where's Daddy? 7 hours after saying I do, Kiara Holloway had become a widow. Her daughter, who had once danced at the wedding reception, was now fatherless. And in Greensboro, a family that had gathered to celebrate love was now drowning in grief. The world moved forward. But for those who loved Tyrek Burton, time had stopped. And the man responsible for their pain? Still out there. Still free. And still unknown. Impact on the family. Grief isn't just about losing someone. It's about the empty spaces they leave behind. For Kiara Holloway, the days following her husband's murder felt unreal. One moment, she had been standing beside Tyrek, holding his hand, laughing about their future. The next, she was screaming his name, watching his life drain away in the very place they had celebrated just hours earlier. Kiara Holloway, a widow overnight. Kiara had spent years building a life with Tyrek. They had endured hardships, celebrated victories, and stood by each other in ways only true partners do. Their wedding day was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, it became a cruel ending. In the days that followed, she spoke sparingly to the media. But in a quiet Facebook post, she wrote, "I lost my husband on the same day I married him. How do you even begin to understand that kind of pain?" There were no answers. Only silence. A daughter's loss. Tyrek Burton wasn't just a husband. He was a father. His young daughter had been there that night. She had seen the flashing lights, the crying, the confusion. And while she may not have fully understood what happened, she knew something was wrong. Days after the murder, a close friend of the family recalled, "She keeps asking when her daddy's coming home. And none of us know what to tell her. Because how do you explain something so senseless to a child?" Community response and the fight for justice. Candlelight vigils and public mourning. Greensboro is a city that knows pain. But it's also a city that knows how to come together. In the weeks that followed, the community held multiple candlelight vigils in Tyrek's honor. Hundreds gathered, holding photos, signs, and flickering candles, their faces filled with both sorrow and determination. At one vigil, a local pastor spoke. "We cannot let this become just another case file. We must demand justice. We must not stop until we find who did this." Tyrek's family made pleas to the public. His mother. His siblings. His closest friends. They all said the same thing. If you know something, speak up. Don't let this killer walk free. But as time passed, those calls for justice seemed to fade into the background. The news moved on. People got back to their lives. And Tyrek's case? It became just another unsolved murder. Theories on the case. With no suspect identified, theories began to emerge. Everyone, from the public to law enforcement, had their own version of what really happened that night. And each theory had its own set of chilling possibilities. Was Tyrek Burton simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? The shooter claimed Tyrek cut him off in traffic. And road rage killings are not uncommon. In the United States, road rage incidents involving firearms have surged in recent years. Some escalate within minutes, a moment of anger turning into a deadly confrontation. But this case felt different. Most road rage shootings happen on the highway, at a stoplight, or in the heat of the moment. This shooter waited. He followed Tyrek. He approached him in a public parking lot, surrounded by wedding guests and family. And then he pulled the trigger. This wasn't reckless anger. This was deliberate. If this wasn't random, then who wanted Tyrek dead? Could someone have been waiting for this moment? Some people questioned if Tyrek had a personal dispute no one knew about. The shooter had followed them from the wedding. The gunman wasn't a stranger at all. But there was a problem with this theory. Tyrek had no known enemies, no history of violence, no past disputes that could explain why someone would gun him down in cold blood. And if this had been a targeted assassination, why do it so publicly? Nothing added up. What if Tyrek Burton wasn't the intended target? What if the shooter thought he was someone else? Mistaken identity happens more than people realize. Drive-by shootings, contract killings gone wrong, gang-related misunderstandings. Could the shooter have been looking for another man? Someone with a similar car? Similar build? Or could he have been sent to kill someone else, only to realize too late he had the wrong person? Police and FBI involvement. With no clear suspect, Greensboro detectives turned to outside agencies for support. How the FBI handles cases like this. When local leads dry up, the FBI often steps in. They analyze surveillance footage with advanced technology. They trace ballistic evidence across state lines. They search for patterns in unsolved cases. But Tyrek's case had a problem. There was no clear suspect, no criminal ties, no digital footprint that led to a suspect. And that meant, without a break in the case, this murder could remain unsolved for years. Tyrek Burton's death was senseless. A celebration of love turned into a scene of horror. A husband, a father, a friend, gone in an instant. And yet, his case remains open. Somewhere, the man who pulled the trigger is still out there. Still walking free. Still unknown. But as history has shown, justice has a way of catching up with the guilty. Sometimes it takes days. Sometimes it takes years. But it always finds its way through. And for Kiara Holloway, for their daughter, for everyone who loved Tyrek Burton, the wait continues. But the search for answers is far from over. The scent of fresh flowers from the reception still lingered in the air. But in a matter of seconds, what should have been the happiest day of Tyrek Burton's life became the last day he would ever see. A father, a husband, a man with dreams for the future. Gunned down in front of the people he loved most. And the person responsible? They vanished into the night. The more you look at this case, the more frustrating it becomes. Because nothing about it makes sense. Who was the gunman? This wasn't a typical road rage shooting. The suspect was never identified, never named, never caught. No arrests. No persons of interest. Nothing. How does someone murder a man in a parking lot, surrounded by people, and simply disappear? And why has he never been found? Tyrek's case wasn't buried in some forgotten alleyway. It happened at a wedding venue, with dozens of witnesses, in a public space. And yet, the man who pulled the trigger walked away, unseen, unidentified, untouched. Is it possible he wasn't a stranger at all? Did someone recognize him? Did someone see his face, but choose to stay silent? Will justice ever be served for Tyrek and his family? Weeks turned into months. Months into a year. The pain for Tyrek's loved ones never faded. The memories never left. But the hope for answers? That became harder to hold on to. And as time passed, the case began to lose momentum. What started as breaking news became just another unsolved tragedy. And soon, Tyrek's name became a headline people barely remembered. But his family remembers. Kiara Holloway remembers. Their daughter remembers. And for them, there's only one thing that matters: justice. This case highlights something we don't like to think about: how fragile life is. How a simple, meaningless argument, something as small as a lane change, can end in bloodshed. Because the truth is, road rage killings are becoming more common. And the statistics are alarming. In the United States, road rage shootings have doubled in the past 5 years. Every 17 hours, someone is killed or injured in a road rage-related shooting. In most cases, the gunman is never caught. This isn't just a Greensboro problem. This is happening everywhere. And it forces us to ask, why does anger escalate so quickly? Why are people so willing to kill over nothing? And how many more lives will be lost before something changes? For Tyrek Burton, those answers come too late. For Kiara Holloway, those answers won't bring her husband back. But justice is still possible. Tyrek's case is still open. And someone, somewhere, knows the truth. If you have any information, even the smallest detail, speak up. Law enforcement is still looking for leads. And sometimes, justice comes from the people willing to stand up and say something. This case should not be forgotten. Tyrek Burton should not be forgotten. His story, his life, deserves more than an unanswered question. And as long as this case remains open, as long as his killer remains free, the search for truth is not over. If you found this case compelling, be sure to subscribe for more investigative true crime stories. And as always, stay safe, because sometimes the most unexpected moments can change everything.